I didn't mind doing an episode solo in honor of my uh, beloved one-time Knicks Film School podcast guest, Zach Lowe. So I already spoke about this on the pod that, Zach's departure from ESPN certainly left a void in the industry, and and that really boiled, or it showed itself after the Towns trade. And like I heard a bunch of people say a bunch of stuff about the Towns trade, and the only person that I really, really wanted to hear and his thoughts of it were Zach, and that sucked that we didn't get that, and um, it is what it is. Life happens. But in honor of Zach, I wanted to do a podcast that takes a page from something that he did before every NBA season, which was writing a column for ESPN in which he named it was usually five, I think maybe sometimes it was six, most interesting players to watch in the season ahead. Now, I'm going to make my own list. I'm going to make it a top 10. I am going to deviate a little bit because his qualifications were he did not choose, I think, didn't choose rookies, didn't choose second year players, because his logic was they were by definition interesting. And he didn't choose stars either, like established superstar level players, because to him, like, what's that interesting about a superstar level player? Um, Although actually now looking at my list, I guess maybe I did somewhat, with one or two exceptions, abide by his standards. Um, and yeah, I did stick with this. Like, I'm not saying anybody that's like super super obvious. I guess in this sense, I think any reasonable mind would argue that the most interesting player in the NBA this season is probably Victor Wembanyama, just because we have a guy who is coming off Rookie of the Year and looked the part and then some of a transformational generational talent, and everybody's waiting to see, well, is this guy going to be like an MVP candidate in his second year? So like, yeah, that goes without saying. And then there's other situations like Kawhi Leonard, right? Like Kawhi Leonard's always fascinating because is he going to play 75 games or is he going to play, 17 games? And he's already dealing with an issue in camp. So like situations that could be summed up in like a sentence. I did not. I tried to veer away from those. With that said, start number 10. And you're going to see my list is going to have a very particular theme when it comes to the bookends, number 1 and number 10. But I'm going to start with Julius Randle. And Julius Randle would have made this list if he was on the Knicks. I would argue that he is slightly less interesting on the Minnesota Timberwolves because whereas on the Knicks, there was this prevailing thought like, all right, we know what the rest of this team is. Like, we know what OG is when he's healthy. We know what Hart is. We know what DiVincenzo is. We know what Mikal Bridges is, even though he's a new face. We obviously know what Jalen Brunson is. But Julius Randle, well, that's maybe the difference between the Knicks going to the promised land or not, and now he is in Minnesota. It's still interesting though. And it's still interesting, I think, for some of the same reasons, but also some different reasons. For one, I find his contract situation now arguably even more fascinating because while the Knicks certainly wanted to stay out of the second apron and, you know, they if they extended him that would have at a certain number, it would have meant that they would have had to go into the second apron. Minnesota now all of a sudden if he was with the Knicks, if he opted in, then they'd be fine. In Minnesota, if he ever opted into that player option in 25-26, that all of a sudden probably forces them, and I just talked to Dane Moore on the Knicks Film School podcast, that forces them to make some either interesting decisions, whether it's letting Nickeil Alexander Walker go, or maybe it forces them to try to hope that someone else makes a beneficial decision. Like Dane Moore brought up the idea of like, well, if Julius opted in, would that mean Rudy would have to opt out of his player option and maybe sign a longer extension at cheaper money? Like, it could really throw what they want to do into disarray. And then on the court, this is a guy who, I don't have to tell anybody listening to this, his stats over the years and his resume. Is he going to close games for them? Is he going to play 32, 34 minutes a night for them? Is he going to be a focal point of their offense in the way he was in New York? And all of those things are fascinating to me because if he is the best version of himself, just like we were saying, well, if you give me the best version of Julius, this Knicks team could go to the finals. I think if you give the Timberwolves the best version of Julius, that team could go to the finals. So still an extremely interesting player. He's number 10. Number 9, I have a tie. And I have a tie between two players who I think fall into the same category for me, and that is LaMelo Ball and Cade Cunningham. I think the difference, obviously, is that LaMelo Ball has already made an all-star team. He's already led a team to the play-in at the very least. Like, he's been the best player on a respectable NBA team. Cade has not. And yet, at the same time, I think if you were to ask the average person who pays attention to this sport, whose stock are you buying more right now? I think at the very least it would be something around 50-50. Because the situation in Detroit has been so bad. And in Charlotte, I think, and you heard a little bit of this from Tim McMahon over the summer, like, are we sure LaMelo, are we sure he's a winning player? And I don't think that critique is unfair. I think especially with the drafting of Brandon Miller, is there a possibility that maybe something along the lines of what happened with Karl Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards? Not saying Brandon Miller's Anthony Edwards, but where it went from being one guy's team to now maybe it's someone else's team. Like, might that happen in Charlotte? And what would that mean for LaMelo Ball? So I think it's a big year for LaMelo and Cade in a similar way. It's like, okay, you got your max extension. It's your last year of your rookie deal. What are you going to be as an NBA player? Because now he actually has a few pieces around him that if Cade is the sort of player that many predicted he is going to be in the league, this is the time. This is the time, and that is that.